Okay, hi there. Welcome to a video walking through a 25-mark essay plan on the impact of globalization. Globalization, a key Year 13 economics topic, one that students get very interested in, and we're actually having a little bit of contextual knowledge on a chosen group of countries that you're interested in can be used to high level effect. So this is an area where it's probably a good idea to think about 2 or 3 countries of particular interest, maybe ones you've studied or you've been to or you know something about, and then try to build up some contextual knowledge. I'll show you how to use this in this essay plan. You don't necessarily need to use an analysis diagram to score highly on these type of questions. Bit of context from the World Bank Poverty Report: about 9% of the world's population still lives below $1.90 per day, adjusted for purchasing power parity. In some regions, in East Asia in particular, there has been huge progress in bringing down extreme poverty, such that only 7% of the population now live below a second poverty line, $3.20 PPP. About a quarter live below $5.50 a day PPP. Indeed, the World Bank now have 3 separate extreme poverty measures. And I think the context here is quite important, that in many East Asian countries it's the $3.20 and the $5.50 poverty lines that are perhaps more relevant. However, more than 2/3 of sub-Saharan African population live on less than the second measure, $3.20 per day. The progress made in cutting extreme poverty has been halted by the pandemic. The World Bank estimate that well over 100 million people in the last 2 years have been pushed back into extreme poverty. And many developing countries just don't have the resilience and the resources to absorb economic shocks, and also, of course, the growing threats from climate change. So here's a question we can walk through. To what extent have the economic benefits of globalization favoured developed, advanced or high-income countries, favoured them over developing countries? My first KA point, my first knowledge application analysis point, argues the following. Globalization involves deeper integration between countries through networks of trade in goods and services, capital flows, ideas, transfer of technologies, and the movement of people. One argument that globalization has favoured high-income countries lies in the growing obvious dominance of transnational corporations, many of whom base their manufacturing, assembly, research and retail across many countries. Indeed, TNCs such as Nike, Apple, Google, Samsung have become synonymous with globalization. Some of them have annual revenues and turnover many times higher than the GDP of smaller low-income countries. And I'm sure you've been following this debate. There's been enormous criticism and discussion about the tax avoidance strategies of TNCs, things like using transfer pricing, profit shifting profits into countries where taxes are lower, which has reduced the tax revenues for governments in developing nations, which then hampers their ability to fund public services, key ones such as education and healthcare. So tax avoidance from highly profitable TNCs limits progress in reducing extreme poverty and also improving basic human development outcomes. Well, a counter-argument to this is that globalization has been associated with a fall in average import tariffs, and that has in a sense improved the access that lower middle income countries have to the consumers in high income countries. And many countries, in particular in Far East Asia, have brought down extreme poverty, now below 7% of the population, because of export-led growth. Indeed, many emerging countries now have transnational corporations of their own, operating on a global scale. And the recent success of countries such as South Korea, India, Vietnam, perhaps countries like Mexico, Ethiopia, is testimony to the opportunities that globalization has offered emerging nations who have managed to develop competitive advantage. So a counter-argument for saying that in some regions many export-driven economies have successfully ridden the wave of globalization to lift people out of poverty. Indeed, emerging nations now have more than approaching 60% of the world's GDP. This is adjusted for PPP. Although, look on the right-hand side there, sub-Saharan Africa has only 3% of world GDP. Second KA point, my third paragraph of 5. A second argument supporting the question is that nations succeeding in a globalising world tend to have diversified economies, a workforce with flexible skills, and governments with fiscal resources to overcome external shocks, including clearly the pandemic. However, poorer countries in a globalising world, not always, but typically rely heavily on the production and export of perhaps primary commodities like copper, tea, cocoa and things, or incomes from tourism. And these are sectors that are clearly very vulnerable to changing world prices and clearly very vulnerable to the impact of the pandemic. And many of these low-income nations have inadequate infrastructure, transport infrastructure, including ports and rail and road systems, and that increases the cost of trade, makes it harder to benefit from globalisation. And their tax revenues as a share of GDP are low because of big size of the informal economy and persistently low per capita incomes. So therefore, national governments in these countries, less developed countries, rely heavily on external debt. Many have very low currency reserves, and therefore they are highly exposed to economic, financial and public health shocks. And I think one statistic which I think is particularly germane and relevant is the gap, the chasm in vaccination rates, the vaccine inequity. As of this month, I'm recording this in January 2022, only 9% of people in low-income countries, the poorest nations, the least developed economies, have received at least one COVID dose, and per capita incomes may take several years to reach where they were before the pandemic. However, in evaluation, globalisation, yes, many low and middle income countries have found it difficult to fully benefit from the opening of markets and trade in ideas and movement of people. But the globalisation process for some countries has been a catalyst for economic supply-side structural reforms. Consider the example of Vietnam. I think this is a good country to study. Vietnam has transitioned over time to a socialist-orientated market economy. It's been very successful in attracting inward investment from companies such as LG and Samsung. And the FDI has flowed in. Vietnam has low unit labour costs, better infrastructure and strong human capital. And the Vietnamese government has moved towards a managed floating exchange rate, which can help to mitigate some of the risks from regional and global economic shocks. So I'm using Vietnam here as a little mini case study as an evaluation point. I think it's a good example of a country that has successfully, in my opinion, progressed from low income, very low income, to low middle income nation over the last 2 decades. It has ambitions to go further. Their trade is nearly twice the size of their national income, and their educational scores, their human capital scores on tests are on a par with countries with much higher per capita incomes, including Germany or Austria. So there are examples of countries for whom the narrative built into the question that globalisation has only benefited the rich at the expense of poor nations can be challenged and questioned. In my final reasoned comment, I argue that it's hard to reach a firm, clear, considered view on this question because globalisation is uneven and it's not inevitable. There's been a switch, both before and during the pandemic, towards regionalisation rather than globalisation. A lot of sub-Saharan African countries have signed up to the African Continental Free Trade Area. And the aim of that, the ACFTA, is to lift trade within Africa, intra-regional trade, to lift investment and encourage African businesses to achieve economies of scale so they can better compete against the market dominance of Western transnational corporations. However, developing nations often struggle to compete with developed countries. That's one of the features of the world economy. And therefore you can argue that free trade, a part of globalisation, tends to benefit high-income countries more. The gains, the benefits, the positive spillovers from globalisation will never be equitably distributed. And in this sense of deepening inequality and opportunity risks a further shift to protectionism and a move towards economic nationalism, which of course is a threat to globalisation. So there we go. That was a walkthrough of a suggested answer to this question on globalisation. It's not a perfect answer. I think it's a pretty good one. Huge thanks for joining in. Thanks for staying with me. Stay safe, look after yourselves, and see you sometime soon.